Good morning. Sorry that I'm a little slow today. Welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. And with me today is my guest, Phoenix Calida. Please introduce yourself and let folks know who you are. Hello?
Oh,
I can hear you again now.
oh, that was weird.
That was weird. Everything was working well before
Okay.
the.
Well, it was fine until I started talking. Isn't that always how it goes? Uh,
This is how all my work meetings go. It's fine until I start talking.
all right. Hey, everybody. I'm Phoenix. Yeah, sorry about that. That was weird. I regret that you all cannot see my face, but I'm sick. It is not something you want to look at right now. It's kind of hideous, actually. But yeah, I don't know. I'm like a lefty. I talk about sex work a lot. I talk about racism a lot. And yeah, I talk a lot of shit on Twitter. I think I don't
Yeah,
know.
I do that myself, and that's important. Talking shit on Twitter repeatedly and loudly and without end seems to have actually broken through on some level in the media about Palestine now. So maybe it's not
Yeah,
completely useless.
yeah. I would like to think that it's not entirely useless, and someone is always learning something or hearing something for the first time. But I think that is just in general one of the difficulties of kind of like being on the left of things is that you are always talking, but you never really know who's listening, right? Because you'll never actually hear about people who are listening to your words or reading your words and it's
I
impacting their
do,
lives.
I do sometimes. That's the thing. I do sometimes, and when I do, it makes me feel wonderful. I
Mm-hmm.
have a few friends who every now and then they thank me. It's like, hey, thanks for turning me on to such and such that I hadn't really thought about before, or thanks for having so and so on your show. I really appreciate that. And it's cool when that happens.
That's
Um,
awesome.
that's the one nice thing, I guess, about being a niche internet micro celebrity.
That is not so bad, actually. Yeah, I don't know. Meh, meh. I don't know, because I'm always getting yelled at by right wingers, so I never really know if
If
people are listening. But it's good to
they
know that people.
the my theory is if right wingers care about you enough to yell at you, they're worried about someone listening.
That is a very good perspective, and I will have to keep that one in mind. And that makes me feel a little bit better about things, I have to say. Because yeah, I get like so much hate mail for my job.
So you talked about sex work and you talked about Twitter, so I'll go ahead and bring sex work and Twitter together right away. And that's you make excellent arguments on Twitter about the connection between Puritanism against sex workers and porn and racism, and
Yeah,
how racism means that it's going to be black people who take the brunt of any criminalization of anything, whether they're the real targets or not.
right.
And
Definitely.
and you made a comment on Twitter that made me start immediately thinking about scheduling you to come on the show as opposed to what I'm always thinking, which is I really should ask Phoenix to come on the show. Why don't I? Because you made a comment about wanting to do deep dives about about things like anti-blackness and anti-queerness and misogyny in history, because the anti-porn people say, well, none of this existed before internet porn. And
Yeah.
I mean, so let's keep in mind that this is a society. The reason that we have a political faction that wants us to take us back in time to an era where more women died in childbirth is because people have hated women for long before internet porn.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think it's also a factor is a lot. I see this argument coming a lot from younger people People who are like in their like 20s, even sometimes teenagers. I really try to avoid interacting with teenagers online at all because, anyways. But I see this argument happening with a lot of younger people. And it seems like a lot of younger people in general sort of have this mentality that like if I didn't see it on social media, it didn't exist. Like that's how they sort of like define history. And
You know,
I think it's an
no,
incredibly dangerous way to do it. But yeah, go ahead.
no. So I immediately had a thought at this, and this is what I was talking about before the show about my problem interrupting because my brain just has thoughts and jumps to them. I actually, and I hate to say it because it sounds like I am agreeing to some point, and I'm not agreeing, I'm explaining.
Mm-hmm.
My experience as someone who was born in the 70s and grew up in the 80s and lived in what I would call not sheltered exactly, but I grew up with a certain number of class illusions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the idea that things would be good because they were mostly good. The idea that, yes, there were some things that were bad, but they were clearly getting better and we could clearly see the progress versus just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that I grew up with as a kid in the 80s from parents who were politically active in the 60s.
Okay.
My parents had this extremely real idea that they had seen things get bad because people couldn't ignore problems anymore and chose to grapple with them. And because people chose to acknowledge and grapple with those problems, we had started to address them and move forward. We hadn't really solved everything, but we had started to make a real movement in the direction of things getting better. And we were going in the direction of where, at the very least, people weren't willing to admit to this stuff in public anymore.
Yeah.
And that by stigmatizing it and being a bigot shameful, that we were slowly making society better. And of course, now we're seeing the backlash of people who feel that stigmatizing bigotry was a denial of their personal rights somehow.
Yep.
And that their freedom of expression should not require them to tolerate the expression and lives of other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, if you go from the point of view of growing up in a time where it wasn't polite to be racist in public,
Mm-hmm.
to the jarring situation on social media where people say all this shit out front and leave it hanging out there. And we now have people in politics now who are saying things so far beyond the pale that Newt Gingrich wouldn't have said him in the 1990s when we all thought Newt Gingrich was crazy.
Yeah.
And so there really is, I understand why people say it never used to be this bad, especially if they were born after the 60s, near the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, because they sort of jumped forward between the big crisis, and they grew up being taught that everything wasn't great yet, but we had confronted the big crisis and looked ourselves in the eye and were moving forward in the right direction, which is, in the end, was probably a comforting lie. And there were a lot of people who were just content to not have things in public, looking at it in retrospect.
So, I mean, I think it always has. Like these people have always existed. It always has been this bad. And of course, I'm saying that from my own perspective, right? Like I'm from Chicago. When I was little, it was like a big deal to talk about like Nazis and Skokie. I don't know if you're familiar with that story.
I'm very familiar with Nazis and Skokie, but My wife grew up in Chicago, but my wife had a very atypical life in Chicago as being from a white family that for economic reasons tend to live in black neighborhoods in the South Side. And so her experience was also very different from the normal.
Yeah, and so like I don't know, and then after I was adopted, I was moved out to the suburbs, and it was like a very white community. I dealt with a
Well,
lot of racism. So like
being
in a
being
certain sense,
adopted would make you would expose you to racism in ways that I never would have been. So that makes perfect sense.
yeah. So like I can't say with social media that like I'm phased by the amount of racism and bigotry. Like it's normal to me, because I've always lived that way. But what I will say is that social media makes it seem more prevalent. Social media is kind of like everyone gets to write a letter to the editor, and all the letters get published, and that sort of allows a lot of these bigots to sort of like find each other and feed off of each other. I think like we've always had these people who have always existed. They've always behaved that way, but social media has made it where like they can just multiply. And so I can see how it's a little bit overwhelming in that sense. But yeah, like I can't say I've really, for the most part, seen anything on social media that I hadn't already seen, in my personal life or heard about anecdotally from, friends, family, coworkers before, like Twitter existed.
And I saw stuff on the internet before social media because I've been on the internet since the internet has existed. And I know that there's always been these people who will say whatever they want on the internet based on the idea that for some reason the internet isn't real. There's some difference between the internet and the rest of reality. And the internet is fake and unique to its own corner of existence, and nothing else should touch it, and it shouldn't touch anything else.
Which is a very bizarre standpoint. Yeah, that doesn't even make sense, but they're out there.
You see it all the time. You see it from liberals all the time. You see it from conservatives all the time. You see it from people who claim to be radicals, communists, whatever, all the time. It's like the internet isn't real and that people should just ignore what they see on the internet in the rest of their lives. And I don't get that.
Which is such a bizarre notion because what happens on the internet absolutely has an impact offline. I know everyone's like, well, if you just log off if you don't like it. It's not always an issue of logging off because, something that I say a lot is, bigots don't clock out of their bigotry, right? So If someone is saying these things online, they're going to, if someone's saying something racist online, there's a good chance they're going to be racist in their everyday lives. And if you happen to be a coworker with that person, if that person is your supervisor, if that person is your neighbor, if that person happens to be a cop who stopped you that day, you know what I mean? Like you still have to suffer the consequences. Like logging off of social media or logging off of the internet is not going to necessarily fix that. And I think people don't really take that into account of how these people behave offline. Yeah, they may not say some of the same things to you to your face because it's not as socially acceptable. But they may still, try to sabotage you at work. They may, I don't know, steal your packages off your porch when they know you're not home. Like they can still be an asshole to you, quite frankly. And I think that's not really taken into account when we do the whole just log off.
And let's take it a step further. The people who are on the internet bombarding it with the hate that leads to bomb threats and mass shootings aren't going away because we log off and don't see them.
Exactly.
And that's the thing that gets me about the Glenn Greenwald view of things, where it's like where we should just let anybody say whatever they want on the internet and not worry about it because that's their right, and it's repressing their speech to come back at them and tell them why they're wrong. Which also I don't get, because isn't that the whole point? If we're allowing someone else to speak, isn't the whole point then for us to rebut them?
I mean, you would think it would be, but no, because apparently freedom of speech or something, I don't know. For all the people who claim they love freedom of speech, no one seems to have read the stupid fucking amendment.
Well, I understand it. I understand it when it's Elon Musk or Peter Thiel.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I understand it when it's Elon Musk and Peter Thiel is because Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are wealthy people who, when they think of free speech, they don't just think of their ability to express themselves, but their idea to have what they want to say expressed on their behalf in the media by others.
Mm-hmm.
There's a if you read, and I don't like to sound like I'm giving mainstream media credit, and because some of these people actually away from the keyboard probably are not particularly radical at all, though one or two of them actually are, and I'm pleasantly surprised by it. But the best left-wing journalism, whether the journalists are left-wing or not, is tech journalism.
Mm.
And this is because good tech journalists are constantly pissing off big tech billionaires.
Yeah.
The reason the original Gawker doesn't exist anymore is because Peter Thiel supported Hulk Hogan in a legal case that bankrupted it, right? Well, the reason Peter Thiel did that, and most people don't think about this anymore, but at the time, the original Gawker was the only media space covering tech startups.
Mm.
And doing so in a honest, objective, and by objective, I mean factually objective, not bullshit neutrality. Objective reporting of the facts of what these tech startups were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And a big tech capitalist who makes his money off tech startups doesn't want you to know what these startups are doing. He might lose money.
Right, right. And it's funny that you mentioned the tech journalist, because actually, as we talk about sex worker advocacy, a lot of tech outlets have become, I don't want to say allies per se, but they have definitely been supportive of sex worker rights, just due to like the vast amount of like censorship type policies and legislations that are coming out, like these age verification bills. Which are just absolutely ridiculous. Like, I don't care what anyone tells you; these things do not protect children. They are designed specifically to target sex workers and LGBTQ.
So let's be straight, because here's the thing: they don't. I'm trying to think of the right way to do this. They do not screen somebody's ability to view content on a screen. They screen someone's ability to pay for that content in the digital space.
Yeah.
Because they're screening out the ability to pay for that content, all they do is guarantee that the person who is paying for content can prove that they're a certain age. It doesn't say anything about who's looking over their shoulder. It never has.
Right. Yeah, and also I find it interesting that as many people are complaining about, we have to save the children from seeing pornography, that a lot of these people don't actually use the already existing filters to try to prevent their kids from looking at these things. But I mean, yeah, I can't stress enough how terrifying it is on from so many different angles with these policies. Because, like, for one, you should not have to upload your ID to look at adult content. You just should not, because it's, and you know, a lot of people are like, well, you have to show an ID to buy alcohol. Yeah, you just show your ID. It's not digitally stored somewhere that can be hacked. It's not put on a list somewhere that can be used against you. You know.
And this is let's talk about this, because people like to make all sorts of self-aggrandizing statements that I've been put on a list by Ukraine or some bullshit like that.
Mm-hmm.
Your credit card may be on a list already based on what websites you visit and what you pay for online and who you donate to. And even for just the most minor things, I don't even really put my payment information out there very much, but I do sign petitions online. And every time I sign a petition online, I get more political content from the Democrats, even if the petition has nothing to do with the Democrats. Why do you think that is? Because the people who handle all these digital verification processes for all the people collecting petitions online are selling the same info to the Democrats.
Yep.
Regardless
Absolutely.
of what the petition is for. And it's not even on the website end. It's on the back end of the people who handle the verification process for the site.
Yeah, and I think that people also don't realize the implications, because a lot of people say, well, I don't care if someone knows I watch porn. That might be fine, but now what happens if hypothetically you're going through a child custody case and now your porn viewing habits come into play because that's an acceptable
You're applying for a job.
Yep.
You're applying for a job, and the company that you're applying for a job with is owned by Puritan Christians, and you don't know it.
Right. Applying for a loan.
They do a financial background check on you to see what your credit is like, and they come up with a bunch of receipts that a PI looks into and says, oh yeah, our background check says this guy watches a lot of porn. Now, am I reaching a little? Sure. But
No,
is it possible? No.
You're not reaching at all. You're not. Like, I guarantee you, as these age verification bills come down, like within the next 5 years, we're going to start seeing people's porn viewing habits like brought into the public light like that. Just because it's an inevitable outcome of this type of policy. And also because the purpose of these policies is not to protect children. It's essentially to put people on lists and try to limit what sort of information and resources people can access. And I know right now a lot of people aren't paying attention because it's only about sex work for now. But as soon as they get done with that, it's going to go to LGBTQ issues. Marsha Blackburn already said that that's what she was going to do with it. After they get done with the LGBTQ issues, it's going to be reproductive health and abortion access and sexual education. Like, all that stuff is going if, these bills don't stop.
And let's not forget, we already get don't say gay, don't say trans legislation in states like Florida and Oklahoma and Texas that is only being held up by court rulings and already has school districts acting like it's already binding at law because they're so scared of what they might be sued or prosecuted for.
Yep. Right. And I think that that's also a big thing about these bills is right now the focus is on pornography because generally we can all agree on what pornographic content is, right?
It's that's the problem. That's the problem. The religious right thinks that certain kinds of people are pornographic.
Exactly. So they're relying on people being opposed to sex work because a lot of people are very anti-sex work and hold a lot of stigma towards sex workers in the industry. But ultimately that whatever is harmful to minors, right? Because who was that goofy ass senator that the clip is going around of him on Twitter where he said that the sex education in schools messes with kids' dopamine and gets them addicted to porn?
Yes.
You're telling me that guy isn't going to try to stop all sex ed in schools, like, because it's harmful to minors? Like, these terms mean nothing. Harmful to minors. What? Right. Gay people are harmful. Yeah, gay people are seen as harmful to minors. Trans people are seen as harmful to minors. Sex education is harmful to minors. Like, anything that's not white Jesus is harmful to minors. And I don't
anything that, and I'm going to jump into psychology and educational theory, but anything that breaks their illusion that a child is a perfect blank slate to be programmed as a parent wants them to be programmed and to believe as a parent wants them to believe and live their life as a parent wants them to live is offensive to them and harmful to minors.
Yes. And I think that really does speak to just the sort of authoritarianism that's prevalent in a lot of types of Christianity. The idea that your children are essentially your property and they should do whatever you tell them to do. Children don't have rights,
This is where it ties into misogyny is older than online porn. One of the first big, what I would call crises in revolutionary organizing was in Marx's own lifetime. Friedrich Engels had written, before meeting Marx, before collaborating with Marx, had written a book on the family. I may be getting the title wrong, so look Google Engels. Don't trust me. But Engels wrote a book deeply analyzing the way the family is looked at in the modern industrial capitalist world in which he lived.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about things like how capitalism was dependent on unpaid female labor,
Yeah.
both domestic and sexual.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about how women were expected to conform both inwardly and outwardly to the morals and ethical standards around marriage, but men weren't. And
Yeah.
that men practiced a de facto polygamy while women were restricted to being the wife to one man and the mother of his children.
Yep.
And he
Yeah.
talked about the deep social inequity of this. And then, because he was a man of his time, he pulled back from the actual true takeaway. And he said, and because of this, it is incumbent on men to respect women by being monogamous, and our society must move in this direction. Now, it's great that he acknowledged all the problems, but his solution wasn't emancipate women from unpaid sexual and domestic labor. It was be faithful to them like they're asking you to, dipshit.
No, that's oddly fascinating. And, there was a point with sex worker history and advocacy where sex workers and non-sex worker women were sort of aligned for a minute about unpaid domestic labor.
My favorite movement from my favorite organization from the women's liberation movement era is one that seems completely forgotten anymore, and that is WHO, the WHO, which stood for whores, housewives, and others being lesbians.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite organizations, and they talked about a lot of things that, no self-respecting liberal white feminist would ever talk about now or even acknowledge.
Yep. And it's very frustrating because it's sort of sex workers in that sense have sort of become like a scapegoat. To be like, well, it's okay to do bad things to a woman as long as she's a sex worker. Like that's kind of where the vibe is in terms of where the sex work stigma is. And it's very frustrating to see that coming from the left because we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot in a way by not acknowledging, sex workers. And this is kind of, what we started off talking about in terms of how people view sex workers and, blaming porn for everything. Like essentially by blaming misogyny on, OnlyFans or on pornography, you're essentially saying sex workers are causing men to be violent. And that's absolutely not the case. Men were violent long before.
Or worse, you see these people who claim to be advocates for porn or sex work who seem to be advocating for porn and sex work as a way to protect good women from bad men by only making sure bad women have to deal with them.
Every single time an incel commits some sort of crime, like a shooting or gets arrested about to do a shooting, that argument comes up every single time. Well, he could have just seen a sex worker. Why should a sex worker have to be in a room with a violent, misogynistic man? Why?
Exactly right.
But people really do try to make that argument, and it's always about the sort of othering of an acceptable sort of like target demographic.
And sometimes the argument is made by people who seem to have this sort of, who seem to believe they're advocating for themselves by volunteering as superheroes for this without really seeing how they're affecting the rest of their community.
Exactly. And it's also like somewhat distressing because it sort of creates like its own fallacy. The idea that if you shit on sex workers and make them the target, that you'll be safe. You're not safe. Patriarchy does not stop with sex workers. Misogyny does not stop with sex workers.
Because as Engels' analysis tells us, and I'm sorry for going back to these old-time white men, it's just this is such a great example of how people define problems and then drop the ball.
Yeah.
The whole point is that women's domestic and sexual labor is being exploited, and it is
Yeah.
being exploited for the benefit of men in a way that, yes, the man in their house is benefiting from it tangentially, but it's really so he can be kept at work all day.
Right.
And
Exactly.
her bondage to him and his home is necessary for his bondage to his employer and for him to produce more good little children for future generations of bondage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is important, if there is something wrong with him, or he and his wife can no longer work, or his children end up not being able to work, well, it's better we just let them all not live.
Yep.
And we start to get into very disposable views of humanity based on this notion of everybody needs to be doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that is, where a lot of resentment towards sex workers stems from as well, is because people don't consider it to be a legitimate job or legitimate labor. And as a result, like, it's okay, like in leftist spaces, it's okay to treat sex
Yes.
workers poorly because they aren't real workers. I see that attitude so often. And it's, very, very frustrating because sex work is work, first of all,
Yeah.
just to be clear. But also it's very frustrating because it inherently ties into other aspects like ableism and racism and, those sort of things. A lot of sex workers who are in the industry are doing it because that's the best way for them to be able to survive, function, and possibly thrive in the society. I know so many sex workers who have, some sort of like chronic illness, or they're a caretaker for someone with a disability, or they have, something that essentially prevents them from being able to do like a more traditional job. And it's fascinating because then that, as this argument continues that it's not real work, okay, so now we have this little utopia. These people still can't work. What are we going to do with them?
And I mean, and I will point out that this is the number of the number of people I know who are in some degree, some kind of sex work because it's the only way they can make a certain amount of money
Mm-hmm.
without doing something even more dangerous or illegal.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the people who are taking that avenue away from people aren't thinking about, well, if this is the only way they can make X amount of money, when you say that you want to abolish their profession, what are you going to do to protect their economic situation? And the answer too often is nothing.
Exactly. Like, I don't know. Have you tried just dying? I don't know.
If we have a social structure that makes survival sex work the most lucrative option for survival for so many people, then that's telling us that if we really see people doing that as a problem, should we not make survival easier?
Right. And you think that that would be the logical outcome, but instead it's mostly just like slut shaming, misogyny, that type of thing.
Which
And,
makes me question whether they really care about the kind of society that makes that necessary.
nah.
And if they don't care about the kind of society that makes that necessary, how can I take their opposition to trafficking in porn and sex work seriously?
Exactly. And it's very frustrating with these types of people because they don't really realize the larger implications of their arguments. They say, well, sex work is exploitation. Okay, well, under capitalism, all labor is exploitation. So now what?
If somebody wants to advance the utopian idea, one day our society will become so free of hangups and so economically successful that no one will ever need to do sex work for any reason of survival, and all sex will always be free and consensually given by the person who's who's choosing to give it to people they wish to give it to, hey, I'm all for that utopia. You want to say we're going to reach a communist state where, you know, sex work won't exist? Sure, maybe we will. But if you're talking about we have to get rid of sex work as a social problem, I don't trust.
Yeah, even from like this sort of like utopian communist post-revolution, whatever the fuck they want to call it, I still don't buy the fact that sex work wouldn't exist, simply because I think that their view of sex is very like basic.
Naive.
Well, naive, but also very basic. I think one of the things, you know, having done sex work is how vast people's sexual desires and needs are. Because a lot of people, like when you think of sex work or you say, you know, everyone's going to have sex for free, they just assume like very basic, boring, vanilla sex. There are people who want way more complicated things than that. And one of the reasons that they seek out someone and pay them for that service is because it's not something that the average person wants to do for free, because it's a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of time and, you know, like that sort of thing. And not everybody is going to want to.
And that's there's a really good argument to make that somebody who is willing to make fantasy X come true exactly the way the person dreaming it envisions it and is able to do so to that perfect person's satisfaction, is that not a form of creative art? Maybe I'm getting out in the weeds there and being a little too pro, but I mean, I understand why there's a market for that under capitalism, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But then you think about it, and then you're right. Those needs don't go away because we're not in free market capitalism anymore.
Right. And I don't think that they've really taken that into account, because, again, they're like, well, it's just a blow job, or it's just a hand job, or it's just, you know, basic sex. And sometimes it is. Sometimes it's way more. And I don't know why people think that, like, fetishes and kinks and, you know, complex sexual fantasies aren't going to exist in this country.
I think it's because this cuts back to this prudish idea of what normal sex is.
Mm.
Because if you think about it,
mm-hmm.
the whole concept of normies versus subculture is based on an idea that, you know, the average person is just doing the average vanilla missionary, maybe a blowjob now and then. If they're really adventurous, maybe sometimes they try anal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of conventional thinking in America around this subject. Even people who don't think of themselves as Puritans are Puritans in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And even if you don't, and I don't even mean Puritans as in by don't get into it themselves, but as in think it's weird. All sorts of people who are fine with vanilla porn would freak out about some of the more specifically kinky stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people who love Peter Sellers' comedy would be freaked out by his parties in Hollywood.
Even Yul Brynner, yeah?
Yul Brynner would not have been freaked out. Yul Brynner and Peter Sellers threw the party together. My favorite, I don't want to call it a fun fact because it's about a gruesome crime, but my favorite sort of
historical tidbit
about crime about true crime, and I'm not a true crime person, but this has always made me go, huh, is that there was a belief in some circles that specific members of the Manson family had known Sharon Tate before the murder because they had worked as sex workers at sex parties Sharon Tate had attended as a guest.
Oh.
And that there was a belief by Brenner and Sellers that it might have been one of their parties. And so they put up a reward for an alleged film that existed of Tate and Susan Atkins having sex with men in the same place.
You know what? That actually tracks because Angela Lansbury, I think her daughter or one of her female relatives almost got caught up with Charles Manson because they met at one of these parties.
People don't understand who Charles Manson was. They think of this hippie cult image that's been created in the media and by Manson himself. And they don't understand that Charles Manson was, and I don't understand why aunties don't go with this more, because he's like the perfect example of the people they're scared of.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Manson was a pimp and drug dealer.
Yeah.
Who was abusive and manipulative of the people whom he pimped and the people to whom he sold drugs, and used this to further his own wealth with no regard for other people's well-being. And there is a very strong likelihood that the specific victims of specific Manson crimes were caught up in the vice of Hollywood and owed the wrong people money.
Yeah. I would, yeah, no, that makes sense. That totally makes sense.
And that with all the with all the cultish stuff aside, Charles Manson was a crook who found a way to make crime pay by turning it into and keeping his people loyal by turning it into a cult.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, I would agree with that.
And so there was lots of speculation about the Tate LaBianca things, where who knew who and was the alleged film real, but the film never showed up, so who knows? But Sellers and Brenner were concerned enough about it being a possibility that they put up a rather large reward for the film if it existed.
That's fascinating.
It is. The other thing that I find fascinating, and this is just about Yul Brynner, because this is not something most people know. Yul Brynner is the only white passing person. I say white passing because he's part Chinese and most people don't know that.
Right.
Yul Brynner was the only white passing person I know of in Hollywood outside more recent to play another white passing person. Usually the actor playing a white passing person is also white. Is actually white and not white passing. Well, Yul Brynner in a movie called Invitation to the Gunfighter plays a black man passing as white and does so without blackface.
I'll have to check that one out.
But it's the only example I know of a white passing person playing a white passing person in a Hollywood movie. It's nearly always a white person playing a white passing person.
Yeah,
and even though he's Asian and not black, it's still interesting to me.
I'll have to look for that one for sure. But yeah,
he did in a few small roles. He did challenge his own passingness by playing an openly Japanese American in a movie about prejudice against Japanese. So so even though he was mostly white passing, he was serious about acknowledging racial issues, which is another thing most people don't know about Yul Brynner.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. He just seemed like a really cool guy from everything I've read about.
So if you want to talk about cool in the sense of what we would call the aesthetic of cool, a whole lot of the lifestyle image that we think of as cool comes from the Hollywood lifestyles of Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen and some other people like that. The aesthetic comes from Steve McQueen and the lifestyle comes from Yul Brynner.
Yeah.
And that's what white people aspire to when they hear the words cool, I would say.
That's accurate.
To look like Steve McQueen and live like Yul Brynner.
No, that's completely accurate, I think. Yeah, it was definitely an interesting time of that era of Hollywood, I think. Just in terms of what people were doing, how people were behaving, and I think it definitely had long-lasting cultural impacts, more so than the average person realizes.
Another thing that I don't think people, and this is my last thing, and then I'll get off the Yul Brynner subject. But the other thing people don't know about Yul Brynner is that during World War II, he did Russian language broadcasts
Mm-hmm.
for Allied radio so that Russians would know what was happening in the Pacific.
I actually knew that one.
That's cool that you do that. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you saw me. I made my little like Yul Brynner like little appreciation tweet the other day.
I did. I interacted with it. I shared some of this in the tweet, and like you do, like I've seen you do sometimes, I try to reference some of my tweets. Hey, that's good. I should say that on a show.
But yeah, no, I like Yul Brynner. He seems like a very cool guy. But yes. Anyways, we were talking about sex work. But yeah, as you were saying about like Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen and how there was this whole like larger than life sort of thing going on in Hollywood at the time. One thing that I find fascinating about the leftists who are anti-sex work is like they don't want anything that even resembles that. It seems like they're very sort of like anti-decadence, and they want like a very drab, like gray sort of not fun existence post-revolution. And that's like so bizarre to me because if you finally get this utopia and everyone has their needs met, why wouldn't it be beautiful and vibrant and fun? Like, why do you want it to look like a Soviet like propaganda poster?
So the first thing, and let's remember, because people forget that for all its successes economically and taking care of people's basic needs, the Soviet Union fell. And part of that was because of the Cold War. That is true. But Cold War propaganda was able to take effect because many people of the people that we would call the professional managerial class here in the United States, or the middle class during an election year, felt like they had all the basic things they needed out of life, but they didn't have any ability to self-actualize beyond a certain point. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is something that I wish communists understood better. Because if you are, and I get why they think the way they think, they are stymied by what they see as society's failure to meet needs. So because society fails to meet the food and shelter and medical care base of the pyramid, there are so many people whose most desperate need is food, shelter, or medical care that our society is obsessed with getting everybody food, shelter, and medical care. Yeah. And people who do not enjoy a lot of the benefits of capitalism can easily think to themselves, well, if we could easily get everybody food, shelter, and medical care, if we just cut out a bunch of these decadent luxuries that only the rich people get to enjoy anyway. I don't get to do those things. I don't need them. Let's just cut that out. And they think they can build socialism that way. Yeah, and sadly, nobody's signing on to be deprived of the better things of life after their basic needs are met.
Yeah, and I gotta say that does remind me of because one of the arguments I hear all the time about sex work specifically is that it's not real labor because it's not producing something.
It doesn't produce value.
And so, like, that's also fascinating to me because I'm like, so then how far does that go? Like, does this mean that, if we get our utopia that we're not going to have, like, concerts? Because concerts don't produce value. They're there for entertainment. Are we not going to have theater? Are we not going to have movies? A lot of things don't produce value, but we want them because they feel good.
And this is where the Soviet system kept running into trouble. Because art needed to produce social value, not economic value. Not like here in the US, where everything has to make money or it disappears, but
Mm-hmm.
somebody has to think that it's socially valuable,
Yeah.
that it sends the right message, that it teaches people to have the right cultural value, which is good up to a point. We want our education to teach the right cultural values. We want our education to teach people to be socialists and not capitalists. I would agree with that. But, and this is where people get hung up, they get into all these notions that the good things that people who succeed under capitalism are able to enjoy are bad because only bad people can have them.
Yeah.
And that's a systemic problem right now, that only bad people can have those things. That doesn't mean that those things aren't desirable or worth having.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people should have the freedom to think beyond the missionary position if they want to.
It would be better for society, let me tell you.
Well, and that's the whole thing. How much that's the real question, and I hate to the whole notion of drafting men into the military. And this is more misogyny that blames women again, but this whole idea was, if you get women into an all-male institution and deny them the company of women, then they'll have they'll be really eager to be violent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
yeah.
That's always been an aspect of Puritanism too, that fascist aspect, where if we control the access of men to women, men will be more likely to be violent. And if that means men are violent to women as a side effect of us being able to exploit male violence for profit or power or both, then so be it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think we see that a lot. Well, I mean, we're seeing it right now in Palestine. Like, I'm losing my mind at the amount of soldiers making jokes and wearing lingerie. Like, it's so fucking disgusting. It's so fucking disgusting. But yeah, I think that that's also a very big part of it. But then that also leads to the idea that certain women need to be protected and certain women don't, right?
Exactly.
Because how old is the trope about sex workers and soldiers, right? Or even, in situations where it's forced, right? Like comfort women, situations like that. And it's like, well, it's okay that those women should have to deal with the violence of, soldiers and, deal with their misogyny.
But let's talk about the reality now. We talk about the tropes. Let's talk about the reality. How many marriages happened because of affairs between soldiers? And I don't want to be too romantic about it, but how many marriages happened and how many children were born?
Right.
How many people formed a meaningful connection? What do we really value?
Mm-hmm.
Because you say you don't want to be overly romantic about it. You want to show the ugly side of war. Sure. And you should. War is ugly. But if soldiers have to be bad people to do bad things, then that means you need bad women to take care of soldiers. And that means you can't talk about the human connections between bad soldiers and good women.
Right. Exactly.
But at the same time, that's a real history of many families' life because of World War II.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're further removed from it now than we used to be, but one of the whole reasons for removing stigma, for trying to remove stigma about kids born outside of wedlock, was because of how many kids were born outside of wedlock as a result of World War II and the Korean War. One of the big reasons for wanting, one of the big reasons that people were friendly to the idea of racially integrating their kids' schools was because Some of them had family who had Asian kids, and in some states, Asians were also included on the whites only list and kept out of white schools. And they wanted their Asian grandkids to go to the same white schools they went with, even if they were racist.
Yep.
And we don't think about things like this. And I mean, in some cases, that was the whole venue for social progress, is that people suddenly had to deal with their multiracial children and grandchildren, and so they were for school desegregation.
Yep. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know that.
I mean, heck, I don't like using liberals as good examples, but look at Barack Obama's racist grandparents becoming better people because they had to raise their black grandkid.
Mm-hmm.
They had to wrestle with stuff that they never would have had to wrestle before. I'm not saying it was necessarily good for him.
Right.
And I think there are lots of class conversations that need to be had, and also in ways whether he maybe learned some racism from his grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
But still, that was fundamental for them learning to love somebody who wasn't like them, and both the positive and negative consequences of that matter.
I would absolutely agree.
Not just the negative or just the positive.
Yeah, this country is just so fucked when it comes to racism. I don't even know. I mean, but then again, when you consider the history of it, I don't know how we're ever going to.
Well, I have ideas. The ideas are all things that involve other white people listening more to people like me and less to the people they're listening to. And that's the part that I don't figure out how to make happen right, because I definitely don't want to go talk to Nazis with the idea of changing their mind. That just seems hazardous to my health.
Yeah.
Also, and more importantly, hazardous to the health of my friends, potentially, if someone lies to me.
Mm-hmm.
But with all that said, I mean, there are certain things, and I'm glad you mentioned the history of race, but, whiteness is this Enlightenment pan-Europeanism that just says all the Germans who killed the Romans should enjoy the fruits of the Roman Empire together, instead of this idea that the French and the British and the Germans should all be racist against each other. And that's how white people came to be. There is no white country in the world.
Right.
There's never been a white country in the world. Before the invention of whiteness to fill a need, the British never thought of themselves as white, and their racism against the Irish and the Scottish was every bit as real as our racism is today.
Right. Yeah.
Genocide and war and atrocity, and it was horrific. And it's the things that white people did to white people over the course of history put the lie to any sort of claim that any other race is savage.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, white people love racism so much. We were racist against each other before we invented whiteness to stop.
Exactly. Yeah, I can't stress enough for people to please go read about Bacon's Rebellion.
Yes.
I think a lot of people don't really understand some of the long-term results of that, right? Because that was how whiteness started shaping America. Because for most of the colonies, in most spaces, before the United States was officially the United States, it was, a member of this colony. That was how they referred to themselves, or, as a British.
At the time of Bacon's Rebellion, they were the property of the Chartered Virginia Company.
Yeah.
And
then all of a sudden, Bacon's Rebellion happened. All of a sudden, the word "white" starts popping up everywhere, and what?
Yes, that was when whiteness was really invented. And it was totally about class, because they had, from their point of view, they had made the mistake of treating slaves and indentured servants the same.
Yep.
They had given them the same privileges. They had restricted them in the same ways. They had put the same limits on their movement. They had let them live in the same places. They kept them away from the good part of town by the same systems. all of this, and freed slaves and freed indentured servants formed communities together because they still weren't welcome in polite society because they were ex-servants or ex-slaves, so they had to form their own communities on the edge. All this stuff matters because it meant that there was no false consciousness dividing the poor white man and the poor black man in pre-Bacon's Rebellion Virginia. There was them and there was the boss.
Yep.
And it was that simple to them. And Bacon's Rebellion, and you can tell it was that simple to them because the negative consequences, the poor black people and the poor white people saw no problem in teaming up together to take more indigenous land. Yeah. That was their demand. They wanted the right to take more land from the indigenous people so they didn't have to take it from the rich white people. But of course, that was still a problem because the rich white people considered the indigenous land theirs too. They just hadn't taken it yet.
Exactly.
And there you have the issues of Bacon's Rebellion.
Yep. And yeah, I would strongly encourage folks to read about that. It really does give it really lays a foundation to explain racial relations in America.
After Bacon's Rebellion, it was simple. Ex-indentured servants were white people with all the social and economic privileges of their former owners, whereas slaves were slaves and would always be slaves.
Yep.
And the former indentured servants immediately became the overseers and forgot all about their old buddies.
Yep. Right. It's what was that book? How the Irish Became White.
Yes, by being cops.
Yes, which is so. I was explaining that to someone the other day, and I was like, it never occurred to you why the stereotype of the old timey cop swinging the baton is always Irish. You never thought, why is that?
In New York City, this is my favorite direct example. In New York City, there were two organizations called the 5 Points Gang, one Italian and one Irish. The Italian 5 Points Gang went on to become famous as the founders of the most successful families of the mafia.
Mm-hmm.
The Irish 5 Points Gang became the NYPD.
That sounds about right.
Oversimplified, but it's exactly what happened. The Irish 5 Points Gang ceased to exist because all the people who would have joined the Irish mob joined the cops instead.
Yep. Yeah, that sounds right. Oh man, it's
and that is the history of racial politics in Detroit. In New York, but other cities too. Detroit, Chicago, Boston.
Yep.
There is a reason that as recently as the 70s, a woman was writing stories about a Polish PI named Warshawski, whose father couldn't get promoted in the Chicago PD because his name was Warshawski and not O'Malley.
Yeah, no, that's completely accurate. Oh my God, yeah. Fucking Southside Irish, man. So many cops down there. So many cops.
But yeah, that's the central gripe. The central gripe of her Italian mother's life was that she married a Polish cop instead of an Irish cop.
Yeah, no, that's unfortunately seems very accurate. Very, very accurate, and it's very frustrating that a group that has been so historically demonized, right? The way Irish people were demonized and essentially tortured and brutalized by the British, right? And then they come to America and the whole indentured servitude, and then just instantly turned around and said, "All right, fuck everybody else, we're white now," and just ran with it.
Well, the quickness. The only, and sadly there are more bad examples of that than there are good examples of French Revolutionary Guards from Poland coming to Haiti to put down the rebellion, defecting to the Haitians, and being declared black by the president of Haiti. There aren't enough real life examples of that. It's happened, but it hasn't happened enough.
Yeah, it's very disheartening to know that someone who was in the trenches with you will turn on you and help brutalize you for just an ounce of privilege,
Yes.
or social status, or a raise, or whatever it is. It's very. I think that also like makes it
And
hard in terms of organizing because it creates distrust.
and for all those people who don't understand it, this racial attitude comes from exactly the same place as your hyper individualistic willingness to screw everybody over at your job.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's easier to make you think like that if you're already thinking of it in racial terms or anti-queer terms or anti-woman terms. Because if you're already willing to screw somebody over for privilege, you're that much more willing to screw your own people over for privilege.
Exactly. And I don't think people really take that into account, because there is as we say, not all skin folk are kin folk, but I don't think enough people really take that lesson to heart.
People focus their, obviously, as they would if you're looking at race by itself or class by itself or any one piece of the system by itself instead of looking at the complex system. But if people who, and it's the worst possible metaphor, but people who only see race can only think in black and white.
Mm-hmm. No,
people who only see class at the same time can only think in black and white, and that means that but in their case, it's their color blindness hurts people.
Right.
In the black and white, in race, if all you see is race, then you miss all of the ways. And I'm going to say this to white people because white people need to listen to this. If you only think about race, then you miss the way that you're being screwed by other white people. But if you don't think about race, you will not understand the mindset that is leading those other white people to screw you.
Mm-hmm. No, that's absolutely accurate.
Because they're taking that racial selfishness and tightening it even more, so it's only the people in their clan or extended family group, or tightening it even more and saying, heck, it's just me and my family, fuck everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very distressing the amount of that, the way that hyper individualism has really sort of permeated American culture. It's I don't think it can even. I don't even know how we're going to fix that, to be quite honest. Because so many people are of the "I got mine, fuck you," or "I'm about to get mine, fuck you" mentality, and it's just devastating.
The only thing I can say is the question about how we can fix that is why I talk once a week on YouTube. It's why I say everything I say on Twitter. It's why I periodically try to force myself to write and ask people for money to motivate myself to write. I'm not as good at asking people for money as I should be. But at the same time, I don't want people who can't afford to pay me. I want people who can afford to pay me to help people who can't afford to pay me learn.
Exactly.
Which is too idealistic potentially and might not be hopeful enough, because obviously the more people can afford to pay me, the less likely they are to care about what I'm saying specifically.
Exactly.
But it is what it is. It's the sad fact of my target audience that my patrons are more likely to become homeless than to win the lottery and become wealthy. And I wish I could change that. And all I can do is try to share whatever I can back into mutual aid when I can afford to.
I mean, I really think that's all any of us can do at this point, because ultimately, even though the message itself is good, even though the ideology is good, it's hard to convince people to get on board because they're so conditioned by the society that we live in terms of, morality and capitalism and, class and race and gender and all these things. And it's very, I think, disheartening to know that we could have a society where everybody could have enough, but everyone is in such a scarcity mindset that I have to have the most, right? The individualism of I have to have the biggest piece of the pie, as opposed to we can all have a piece.
Or the guilt for not being able to help people. I want to talk about that, because I think this is something that motivates some people into becoming curmudgeons and angry and selfish and liberal. Because people talk about liberal guilt all the time, but they don't talk about poverty guilt all the time. Not even necessarily real poverty, but the sort of living to paycheck where you feel guilty that you can't do more to help people who are even worse off than you are.
Yep.
And you feel so overwhelmed by your inability to not help people that you start making excuses to yourself for why it's okay not to help people this time.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where this starts to feed into our ideas of worthy and unworthy poor people, and worthy and unworthy victims, because we feel guilty because we can't do more. And we want the help that we do give to do the most possible good. So we come up with these justifications in our head for why the people we help deserve it and why the people we don't help don't deserve it.
Yep.
And that is harmful. That is far more harmful than helping who you can and trying your best not to feel guilty about the folks you can't help. Because now you're scratching large groups of people off as not deserving of help if someone else helps them.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's
now, instead of helping the people you can help yourself, now you're arguing with the people who are helping the people you're not helping about why those people don't deserve to be helped.
Yep. How many times I'm not going to give money to a homeless person? They're just going to use it on drugs. Who the fuck?
Yeah.
Who cares what they're using it on? Just give them $5.
Who has more of a right to get high if they want to than someone who lost their home and doesn't have one?
I think for me the biggest hypocrisy of that is people do drugs all the time. They just do them in their houses and you don't care.
Rich people have to be put in IVs to save their lives after partying too hard.
And you're not complaining about that, but you're going to complain that someone who's homeless has a pint of whiskey or something. Get the fuck out of here.
We don't complain about that because they can afford it. And that is and that's really the ultimate sort of classism of all this Puritanism and Nazism. It's this judgmental attitude of the lower middle class on the people that they can't help, and so they've decided don't deserve their help.
Yeah. And it's fascinating that the way our relationship is with money and wealth and power and privilege, that somehow it's okay for people at the top to be the most immoral, how many fucking kids does Elon Musk have?
Oh, that's not just so, and that's just not even the whole conventional morality thing either. That ties into the whole eugenics Nazi thing, because
absolutely,
he's specifically trying to pass on his billionaire genes to save the world.
Right. Oh yeah, it's absolutely eugenics with him. But it's fascinating because if someone, especially if they were not white, and especially if they were poor, had that many kids with that many, it'd be wise, make them get a
no. Hey, it doesn't even matter if they're poor. If they are a black celebrity who has a lot of illegitimate kids, will have a lot of jokes made about the number of illegitimate kids they have.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm always fascinated by how it's okay if you're in a certain position that you can do all the bad things. You can do drugs. You can get divorced. You can have children out of wedlock. You can cheat on your taxes. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine if you're one of those.
The only politician, to my knowledge, who has ever had a criminal investigation run into his civil divorce was a black man. His name was Edward Brooke.
Mm-hmm.
He was the first post-Reconstruction black man in the U.S. Senate. He was the liberal Republican who co-sponsored the Civil Rights Act and wrote the Fair Housing Act.
Uh-huh.
So,
I can see why they didn't like him.
So now, here's the fun part. He was running for re-election against a conservative white Democrat named Paul Tsongas, who was to his right on every issue. And a liberal white prosecutor named John Kerry, whose values were allegedly more in line with Brooks than Tsongas's, opened a criminal investigation into certain matters connected with his civil divorce during the election in order to help Paul Tsongas win.
That is fucking grimy.
Now, this is liberal John Kerry, the I protested the Vietnam War guy.
Uh-huh.
And this is in 1976, just 3 years after his height of I protested the Vietnam War fame.
Wow, that is really incredibly grimy.
But this is part of why the Democratic Party looks the way it looks today.
Mm-hmm.
Because another fact, the guy who Joe Biden beat for the Senate 4 years before Tsongas beat Brooke. In 1972, Joe Biden ran for the Senate as a Democrat against a Republican incumbent named Caleb Boggs. J. Caleb Boggs went by Cale Boggs to his friends and in the political media. Cale Boggs was another co-sponsor of the Civil Rights Act. He was someone who signed all of LBJ's Great Society stuff into law, who signed off on all of it, helped whip Republican votes for it, was one of the close Senate associates of Nelson Rockefeller, one of the people who helped get all the iconic liberal stuff under Johnson and Nixon passed, all the welfare stuff that progressives claim to be defending now, right? So that's the guy that Joe Biden ran against. This was a guy who had co-sponsored the Civil Rights Act, and the guy who beats him co-sponsors a bill that de facto ends Brown v. Board at law because now you can't enforce it by busing kids.
Wish I was shocked.
So that's how the Democratic Party came to look the way it looks now, because they deliberately chose to run to the right of suburban liberal Republicans whose constituents were mad at them for letting more black neighbors move in.
I see absolutely nothing has changed because they're still doing that now. Hey.
Yes. That's the Democratic Party. This is the post-60s Democratic Party. And you would think, for all of the gains and successes and great things to point to that came out of that civil rights era, instead they just see the failure of losing some swing voters to Nixon in 1968. And as a result, they tanked their own candidate in 1972 for the presidency. And the Democrats who did go to Congress and the Senate in those huge Democratic Party victories of 1972 and 1976 were guys who would have been supporting Nixon in 68.
Yeah, I'm not even remotely surprised at this point. It's just very frustrating that it seems like we never actually learn anything from history.
We don't.
And not only do we keep repeating the same mistakes, but it gets a little bit worse every time. You know,
as it should. I mean, if you think about it, it should get worse every time we repeat the same mistakes because we're fucking up repeatedly and worse. I mean, it only makes sense because every time we make that same mistake, despite all the previous warnings, we're doing that much more cumulative damage. and we don't care about our history for mistakes, so now we're doing it more recklessly.
Absolutely.
I mean, and this is why it feels, and to cut back into this whole, well, it was never this racist before, is so this is because we keep making the same mistakes. It's not that it was never this racist, it's that it was never this intense and in your face and openly bad.
Mm-hmm.
It was all under various layers of socially acceptable masks, and the resentment at having to wear those masks, combined with the guilt, among others, of not being able to live up to the mask, is just causing people to not care and to say fuck it and to act out on purpose.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's, I think also, a lot of people, I think, because they're able to connect, how we kind of started off by saying about social media, is that because people can connect with each other on social media, I think they feel emboldened to be like, oh, I'm not the only one who feels this way. There's a lot of us who feel this way. And like all of a sudden they get extra confident in their bigotry.
I have a friend. I would love to do a show with both you and him sometime, now that I think about it. But I have a friend, Connor Exum. He's been in the chat today. He runs a Substack called Leon Trotsky's Revolutionary Newsletter. He goes undercover in these fringe sites that are basically right-wing cesspools, so that he can take screenshots of the sort of stuff that's actually going on and write articles about how companies that run snowplow billboards are essentially hosting these MAGA cheerleading political operations because that's where the content is coming from. So that's what's bringing them members.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're dependent on selling your advertising on this website, you have to be able to prove you have an active membership, which means if you get rid of the Nazis, you don't have an active membership anymore, and you're going to lose all your advertising money. And now you're in a capitalist trap where you're dependent on the success of Nazis pushing their ideas to keep making money.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's very frustrating, to say the least, that it has come down to this, and that this is how the business model is. And I really resent the fact that every single thing has to make the most amount of money possible. Otherwise, it just ceases to exist in the system.
And
it's very disheartening about
that. That's ultimately the lesson that people came away with from the 70s. Well, if we just make the most amount of money possible, then we'll be able to pay for everything. But that's not how it works. Making the most amount of money possible requires not paying for anything. Look at Donald Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, yeah, I mean, really, everyone just...
Or heck, political success requires not paying for your mistakes. Look at Joe Biden.
Yes. Yes. And always profiting off someone else's labor. And it's always just a struggle to get higher up on the ladder so fewer people can profit off of you.
And one of the reasons that I'm most intensely anti-Democratic Party is because the Democratic Party consists of people who are like Joe Biden for their career, and they are basically taking advantage of the most idealistic people in the party while they're still idealistic, while at the same time beating them down and making them more like them to take their place in the future.
Yeah.
And it's just, and I see that, and I was like, you realize that this is exactly why nothing gets fixed, because you advance the most cynical and the least compassionate and the most triangulating and calculating, and they only think about money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of people are sort of realizing that with AOC in particular. A lot of people had high hopes for her. When she started her political career, now they're just like, what the fuck is going on? I know I myself was pissed off at her recently with that.
I have pretty much So I'm going to give you the good and the bad here, because I'm going to try to follow up on my own, what I've been complaining about, people not seeing the positive and negative consequences of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say something bad about AOC,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to say something good about someone else.
Okay.
Like you, I'm tremendously disappointed in AOC. I have come to believe the World Socialist website take that she was always just sort of the next sort of flashy thing from the Democrats and never really intended to be anything different.
Mm-hmm.
That's been something that the World Socialist website was sort of warning people about at the beginning, and their stuff has really held up well and aged well afterwards. So I have to give them credit for that.
Mm-hmm.
But so disappointment with AOC aside, who I believe is the worst sort of bougie poser who really doesn't have any interest in anyone worse off than her in a material sense. I would like to point out that it was not too many years ago now that Jamal Bowman was facing disciplinary action from members of Democratic Socialists of America because he was too pro-Israel. And that after actually visiting Israel, he realized, hey, there's an apartheid there.
Mm.
And that he has been consistent in his values since actually visiting Israel. And I don't like giving establishment politicians a shout out like that, but I just want to show that sometimes seeing reality does make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Jamal Bowman was theoretically pro-Israel until he actually went there.
Yep. I have heard a large number of people say that too, that they supported Israel and then they got there and that was what really changed things for them.
That was what changed things for the people who founded the now mostly moribund Communist Party of Israel. They were all the worst war criminals from Irgun and Lehi,
Mm-hmm.
who really came to terms with the shit they had done, and who founded a communist party, and who were in solidarity with the most extreme Arab parties from then on.
Mm-hmm.
We had a moment there.
What?
We had a moment there. One of our connections dropped you and brought you back, so I don't know how much you heard.
I think I heard it all, actually.
Yeah, but yeah, the Israeli Communist Party was founded by some of the worst people who came to terms with what they did and were like, wow, we did this wrong. And those people are all gone, and now these group of so-called Israeli leftists who don't really have much understanding of that are sadly supportive of many of the same things that their predecessors had learned the hard way to oppose. And it's just weird. It's like like you're saying, we continually lose the history. Not even just that we don't we don't learn from it, but people don't learn about it, and children don't know that this stuff has happened. And the thought that they might learn about it scares people.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's people are going to be scared because then they have to explain themselves.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because now you have to explain why you were just dead ass on the wrong side of history and didn't even try to change after you knew you were wrong. Like, there's, I think, a lot of sort of like residual shame in that.
Yes.
That's like, because everyone, like now with the whole fucking CRT, we can't teach kids about race and all that stuff. Like, what I find it's so fascinating to me, the whole argument that, well, it's going to make white kids feel bad. And it's like, why would it make white kids feel bad unless
they haven't done anything wrong?
Unless their families were the ones who were on the wrong side of history.
Well, but and that's the real thing. It doesn't make white kids feel bad. It makes white kids' parents feel bad.
Exactly.
Or worse. The parents who really are racist and want their kids to be racist too do not want their message diluted.
Yeah.
And I really think it's important to understand that Nazism is generational. When we almost made a mistake. No, I'll take back the almost. we made a mistake by ever putting a neo in front of the word Nazi.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
when we put neo in front of the word Nazi, we were trying to say that it somehow did not have any continuity with the Nazism of World War II, that it was some new reactionary expression of people who were trying to recreate something that was gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not. It's just the expression. It's just the ongoing inheritance of those ideas from the people who had them before World War II in the United States, and the people who settled in the United States and Canada and South Africa after World War II, because that was the only place Nazis were welcome.
Yeah. People think I'm kidding when I say I've met Nazis. Like, I don't mean neo-Nazis. I mean the original old guys. Like, they're all dead now. But the place where when I said I got sent out to the suburbs when I got adopted, but it wasn't that far from like a scientific facility. I don't want to like say the name of it and like give up all my information like that.
Yeah,
but a scientific facility, and a lot of people who worked there were German, and they would never come out and say they were Nazis. All they would tell you was that they worked for the government when they lived in Germany. And then you find out they got here in like 1948, and you're like, wait a minute, what government is Germany? Because
my favorite joke is about Werner von Braun, that his autobiography should have been entitled "I Aim for the Stars, but I Keep Hitting London."
But yeah, and and like again, the Skokie thing was a very big part of my childhood, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, no, the original. Like, I saw the original Nazis, and then I saw their kids, and then I saw their grandkids, and now I see their great grandkids, and yeah, not all of the kids are okay. Let me put it that way.
But that's really the whole thing, is that, Nazis teach their kids to be Nazis. When they talk about family values, they're talking about teaching their kids to be Nazis. They're talking about they're talking about teaching their sons to be racist bullies, and their and their daughters to marry them.
Yep, exactly. And that is a bleak future. Very bleak.
It's a terribly bleak future. And it's the sort of future that, I mean, you look at the way these liberal urban Democrats make fun of people in the South, and you would think that they wanted to avoid that future. But they really don't. They just don't care about the people who are victimized by it.
Right.
They want to dismiss those people as deserving of it. And we go back to that again.
Mm-hmm.
Which ties back into the sex work again, because it's always easy to say, here, these people don't deserve it, they're sluts.
Exactly. It's very, I think, I'm always baffled by people who don't really understand how precarious that sort of argument is. You know what I mean? Because, like, someone will say, oh, well, you deserve that if you're a sex worker. But then, you can be assumed to be a sex worker because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yes.
If you were a woman, you could have been wearing, a short skirt because you were going to a club, and something happened to you. And now
you're going directly into all the you're explaining why people make all the apologies they make for rape.
Yeah, exactly. And it's
if you can do it to a sex worker, you can do it to someone who you think is a sex worker.
Exactly. You can do it to someone who hangs out with sex workers.
Yes.
You can do it to someone who lives near sex workers. And
let's just hang this right on the perfect hypocrisy nail, and go with what you just said. It's okay to do to anyone who hangs out with sex workers, you have just made the Christian argument for why it's okay to rape Jesus.
I don't think Christians would appreciate that argument.
They absolutely wouldn't. They absolutely would not. But that's the reductio ad absurdum that they're putting themselves in.
Mm-hmm. But I'm sure that they'll find a way to do some sort of mental gymnastics, and that's different. It's not the
There's
same
always
thing.
there's always mental gymnastics because it all comes down to I'm the baseline for normal, I'm the baseline for good. If everyone were just more like me, we'd be fine.
Yes, every time, every time. Except there is no such thing as normal. That's the
No, that's really this whole thing. That's why even though I use the term normies a lot, I sort of don't like to do it because normies are just people who are in the closet and lying about how weird they are.
what is the saying? Normal is just a setting on the washing machine.
Normal is the set of kinks everybody agrees on.
Yeah, and even then,
Well, and that's
because
the whole thing is, there are so many things. When you judge it that way, then as long as you stay within those boundaries, there are all sorts of horrible things that can happen to people.
oh, absolutely. And also, I think it's fascinating that um, because a large amount of people agree on something that will be perceived as normal, but that
Yes,
doesn't really account for the fact that some people ended up coming to the same conclusion, but they got there for radically different reasons.
yes.
And
Also,
so,
look at our politics, where people are agreeing on something being normal and making it normal in a legal sense 10 and 20 and 30 years beyond the actual cultural norms
yeah,
because they're so stuck in the past because they're all old
hmm
or
oh God,
because they have the values of old people if they're not old themselves.
no, absolutely. I think that's it's the Christmas music, right? That like the most popular Christmas songs, like outside of Mariah Carey, there hasn't really been like a new mainstream popular Christmas song since like 1960 something, right? We're still
Something like
playing the
that.
same
Yeah.
Christmas record.
Even Twisted Sisters, really, really excellent. My Heavy Metal Christmas has not become the pulp culture
Yeah,
icon that it should be.
yeah. I think Mariah Carey is like the only recent modern artist that has a Christmas song that sort of, I won't, you can't say everyone because there's always someone who doesn't know, but generally speaking, everyone knows.
There's
Other
a
than that,
great
they old
there's a
songs.
there's a great Christmas album with Twisted Sister and Lita Ford, but it didn't break through to the mainstream,
Mm,
so it doesn't
I'll,
count.
I'll have to look for that. Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
But
Twisted
yeah,
Sister and Lita Ford.
but yeah, that's but that's normal. So here we are. Like what?
Now, but here's the thing, though. I mentioned Lita Ford. If you are a member of the band The Runaways in the 1980s, it's normal to be a great big slut and proud of it, and it's shameful to be the born again Christian.
Yeah.
And maybe that society is a little healthier than ours.
I mean, I would argue that it is. I certainly will say, hanging around sex workers tend to be, on the average, I would say, more compassionate, more empathetic, and more rounded than people who are not in sex work.
What
Just because of the range of things that they've seen and experienced. Like, they're much more interesting people and usually much kinder people.
one of the things that I noticed relatively early on was the number of sex workers who were following me for my political content.
Yes. Sex workers love to talk about politics.
Yes. And what's more is that a lot of sex workers who love to talk about politics are really, 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 really left wing in a way a lot of these people who think of themselves as communists aren't.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Which brings
Um,
me back to the first crisis
yeah,
in socialism, and Engels pulling back from his own conclusions. The first candidate, the first avowedly Marxist candidate for president in the United States, was a woman who had been thrown out of the International by Karl Marx himself, along with the leadership of most of the American Communist Party, because they believed that in the United States, in order to make a serious anti-capitalist revolution, the very first thing they had to focus on was women's liberation and free love.
And they would have been correct.
That's the whole thing. I agree with that. And they considered free love and the full political emancipation of Black Americans to be the two most important political issues of the day. And Marx considered this bourgeois and anarchist because it didn't directly impact the material needs of workers enough. But they're saying no, is that the most exploited workers in America are housewives.
Mm-hmm. I think that's incredibly accurate, and it's kind of funny to hear that was considered to be a sort of bourgeois argument, because that's how the online communists are now. I swear, like, I will never identify as a communist because the online people have ruined it for me. Marxist, Leninist, communist, none of it. Like, you might get a socialist out of me, but their analysis on sex workers is so incredibly lacking, and it not only is it depressing because as leftists they should know better, it's that they can't see how that seeps into other aspects and how they perceive other demographics.
So there is a disconnect between what the Bolsheviks said and what the Bolsheviks did before Stalin and what Stalin did and said that gets lost. And people use weird liberal, and I say liberal, I know the Leninists will hate this, but they use liberal things that were said by Leninists to support conservative things that Stalin did. So there were several Bolshevik feminists who wrote at length about how both being a housewife and being a sex worker was a form of very specific capitalist oppression. And that they should strive for a society in which women were free to work and love on the same basis as men, and that in this free society that sex work would not exist in the way it does now, and that sex workers would be liberated from the bonds of capitalism and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take their stuff literally, it is tremendously emancipatory. If you take it from a Puritan point of view, it becomes a weapon against sex workers.
Yeah.
Because what the Bolsheviks actually did was decriminalize sex work, decriminalize sodomy, and decriminalize abortion. Now, what Stalin did when he became the arbiter of what was appropriate and had the necessary influence, he and his fellow bureaucrats then used very liberal arguments against the capitalist industry of sex work as arguments for the recriminalization of sex work, along with the recriminalization of sodomy, along with the recriminalization of abortion, as part of Stalin's attempt to make nice with the Russian Orthodox Church.
Right.
This is something that I wish more Marxists and Leninists would wrestle with, because all too often it's all about cheerleading for who their favorite person is, regardless of the actual historical analysis of what he did and didn't do, in which people who are absolutely great on queer rights think Stalin would have been too. And sadly, that wasn't the case.
Right. Yeah, I think a big part of the problem is, one, that people don't do the research. And when they do research, they only look at it like based on current on current cultural context, not necessarily with the accurate historical context of which it happened.
Well,
Um,
and the actual historical context is so much more interesting, because the actual historical context of, say, Cuba is that Castro fell prey to conservative Catholic thinking on the subject of gay rights during the AIDS panic, realized what he was doing, apologized for it, eventually made it right, and now his granddaughter helped lead a constitutional referendum that now makes Cuba the most advanced queer rights country in the world.
yes.
And you see this reduced to by a capitalist. Well, Castro put queer men in prison. Yes, he did. But what happened after that?
Right. Right. And I think that's where a lot of the disconnect comes from. But then also, like, I'm not gonna. Honestly, also a lot of, and I keep trying to stress, like, the online Marxist,
Yes,
communist, whatever,
yeah.
because they're just a whole different breed. But I also find, like, they almost treat it sort of like religious dogma, and it very much reminds me of Christians who cherry pick out of the Bible, right? How they'll, like, always point to that one verse in Leviticus about how gay sex is bad, and then, like, they'll go eat, like, a shrimp taco, you know, like
Well,
that
it's
sort
like,
of thing.
if you really took Marx's stuff about religion seriously, and I've said this to a couple of people, I was like, if you really took Marx's attitude about religion seriously, your attitude about Marx would be completely different.
Mm. They don't want to do that, though. It's more fun to cherry pick and, sort of use it as a sort of cudgel to kind of beat people over the head with, to pretend that you have some sort of superior sense of morality or some deeper understanding of the world. And it's just like, just go outside and touch grass, please.
Yes. But but here's something disturbing. Those are the people who are organizing a lot of the communist reading groups in the community. They're not just online activists. Those are the people organizing a lot of communist reading groups in various communities and giving people their first exposure to communism. And they're doing both good and bad things as they do it. They're popularizing communism with younger people in a big way, but they also seem to be passing along a lot of very reactionary ideas within this more honest economic analysis, and it's not truly liberating. It's just like changing the bureaucracy around.
Yeah, I find with those types that there's a lot of racism and a lot of misogyny. But the misogyny tends to slide under the radar because it's just framed as being anti-sex work or anti-sex worker. But a lot of the arguments that I find to be inherently misogynistic, because it's like, for example, like the all sex work is a rape thing. And it's like, so you are comfortable telling women that you've never met whether or not they've been assaulted? Like, what kind of fucking arrogance? But that also, implies to me that you think women don't have bodily autonomy because they're not capable of giving consent or retracting consent.
But isn't, and this is where I have to be careful, because rape culture is very real. But at the same time, aren't there people out there who are trying to profit from rape culture by telling people that whether or not they've been assaulted, that they don't know?
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
And I see this, and it's because you have to believe victims. You have to believe victims in order to have any system of accountability. The first step has to be that you have to listen to people, you have to believe them, you have to be open to what they're saying. Because so many more accusations are true than are false.
Right.
At the same time, there are people out there looking to profit from accusations.
Yeah.
even, and if they at first they profit from true accusations, but if true accusations, the trouble is anybody who profits from accusations is eventually going to eventually might be tempted to create them, and at the very least isn't actually interested in solving the problem.
Yeah. Yes. You're very much actually reminding me of Somali Mom right now. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with that whole situation.
I don't think I am.
So Somali Mom has dropped off the radar now, but used to be a very prominent anti-sex trafficking activist in South Asia. And it turned out that she was fabricating stories about, young girls and women being sex trafficked. And one of the cases that came to light was one of the women who was telling a story very clearly, had happened to her eye, like clearly something had happened. And she was telling the story about how she was forced into a brothel, and I don't remember if she said it was a client or her pimp stabbed her in the eye and then made her keep taking customers that day. And that's why her eye was like that. And so someone actually went and did some background checks, and it turns out Somali Mom basically coerced this woman and coached her to say that she had actually had a tumor in her eye as a child and had it surgically removed.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, you fucking piece of shit to coerce. And Somali Mom was basically rounding up these girls and women to tell these stories that were fabricated, but was telling them that, well, it didn't happen to you, but it happened to someone else. So if you don't tell this story, it's going to keep happening to them. And essentially, I would argue, emotionally blackmailed them into telling these horrific, torture porn stories to Westerners for funding. And it was just absolutely disgusting. And, yeah, and
people ask me why I'm skeptical of the Saw movies.
Right. And it was, and Somali Mom, after it came out that the allegations were false, that's when Somali Mom dropped off the radar. But before that, she was very well known in humanitarian circles. Nicholas Kristof wrote a book with her.
Him.
Yeah. Mr. We can't allow people to do sex work, but we can force them to work in sweatshops because there's dignity there. Yeah.
Fun fact. Nicholas Kristof's family owns a farm in Oregon, not too far from where I live. And we were saved. I hate to give liberals credit for anything, but we were saved by the wisdom of our Oregon State Supreme Court, which ruled that Nicholas Kristof is not an Oregon farmer and cannot run for governor.
I remember that. He was so angry too, but yeah,
he was really angry. Yes, but I laughed. I was so glad he wasn't on the ballot. I don't even vote, and I was so glad he wasn't on the ballot.
But yeah, that's, a lot of the anti-trafficking orgs rely on that sort of thing. And another big thing is they very much rely on incredibly traumatic narratives, and there's very little, whether the stories are true or not, some are, some aren't, but regardless, no one is taking time to emotionally care for the victims of these stories. And literally with some of these anti-trafficking orgs, your only job is to kind of, be trotted out on stage to tell a room full of strangers about a horrific abuse you suffered, and then just go back and shut up while they cut checks, and we'll call you out again next time it's time to tell your story. And it's terrible.
And whenever I talk to somebody who's only interested in hearing from exited sex workers, it seems like all the exited sex workers who are doing well and making money work for one of these anti-trafficking groups.
Yes, they are, because that's absolutely accurate. And it's very frustrating because when you hear a horrific story about someone being abused or assaulted, of course you want to help, but because of the emotional appeal and the way they tug on your heartstrings, it leads to people uncritically supporting them, like not asking where the money is going, not asking what services these organizations are allegedly providing, not asking how to actually effectively combat trafficking, and so now we're in this, sort of place where, Lila Micklethwait was one. She was she was the one who was trying to get Pornhub banned. It turned out like someone who was trying to help her who had been trafficked, Lila would like text her and send her images of, pornographic things off Pornhub to be like, do you know this person? Is this person being trafficked? Now, if someone had been trafficked and abused, why would you just send them videos of what you assume is someone else being assaulted and be like, fix this for me? Like, it's
constantly traumatizing someone.
Exactly. And like that is why I'm so angry at the anti-trafficking industry, is because that's so much of what it is. Yeah. And they're not actually coming up with effective solutions. But because, people say trafficking and, children are being raped and women are being raped, and now everyone is just take our money and fix the problem. This is terrible. Now we have a point where, if you read when police say they're doing a human trafficking sting or a sex trafficking sting, they're not finding victims. They're just arresting sex workers.
And this is how a guy whose friends keep being accused of being predators,
yes,
runs an anti-trafficking organization.
Yes.
And if you're not following the story, I'm throwing shade at Ashton Kutcher.
And testified in front of Congress and basically helped police create facial surveillance tech. And it's like, it didn't help anybody. And it's so frustrating for me, especially as a leftist, because this is kind of getting back to how I started on this rant with the online, is because y'all won't listen to sex workers because you are supporting this idea that all sex work is rape, just like they are. You now find yourselves collabing with them or not seeing the consequences of what's coming down the line. And now the same sort of technology and spying on people that was done to monitor sex workers for their own safety, I might add, is now being employed against women trying to leave the state of Texas to get an abortion. Y'all really didn't see it coming because the whole thing was rooted in misogyny, but because it was shit on sex workers, nobody saw the rest of the misogyny coming, right? It's the same thing with the surveillance of the too many condoms, right? So with the stop and frisk, right? Stopping and frisking people because they might be sex workers has now led to sex workers not being able to carry condoms because that is evidence that you are doing sex work. Not a great harm reduction strategy.
Which also means that anybody who's dressed in a way that might perceive someone to see them as a sex worker has to worry about that, and has to worry about whether then, if they carry condoms because they're planning to have sex and they want to be safe, they're going to get charged with something.
Yes. And of course, let's be honest, this is predominantly happening in non-white neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods, to top it off. And
the people who are most predominantly hurt by anything that explicitly targets sex workers are Black and Indigenous women.
Yes, every single time. And it's very frustrating that, this is how things are going. And yet somehow a certain strain of leftists are willing to sort of tolerate a police state, tolerate government overreach, tolerate eradication of civil liberties, because hating sex workers is apparently more important than having rights for some reason.
And then the next natural outgrowth, which is what we're seeing from the anti-porn, anti-sex work, is queer people are porn. Our kids shouldn't have to see them.
Yes. It's queer people. It's also very much tied to reproductive health and sexual education, right?
Yes.
And it's just going to keep going from there.
I'm call me suspicious, but when I hear that one of the biggest problems of reporting child abuse is that many times the children don't have the vocabulary to explain how they're being abused, obviously sex education would give children the vocabulary to communicate how they're being abused very clearly and explicitly. And abusers don't like that.
Definitely. No, I agree 100%. And I think that abusers don't want that. And also, I think that, quite frankly, a lot of people don't want to know about abuse victims because a lot of people would rather pretend that, if their child were to have the vocabulary, be able to come home and say, Mom, Dad, this person is doing this to me. The families themselves, I think, don't want to address it because oftentimes the abuser is someone they know or someone they're related to. They don't want to think that their pastor is an abuser or that their kid's coach is an abuser or that their uncle is an abuser. So
shouldn't they have suspected their pastor was an abuser when he expressed interest in marrying their 15-year-old daughter?
You would think, but apparently that's God's will, and apparently there's nothing wrong with wanting to have sex with children if God said it's okay, and sometimes God said it's okay. So as long as it's hetero and you're married, it's fine, I guess. I don't know.
Well, and as long as, but I mean, this seems to also feed back into attitudes about abortion as well. And I find myself confronted with the amorality of a political system that, while claiming to oppose sex work because sex work dehumanizes and devalues women, at the same time forces women to marry their rapists because parental rights.
Right. Yeah, and share custody with rapists. Oh my goodness, who was it? I forgot what state it was, but just closed their spousal rape loophole a couple months ago. The fact that that's still.
I mean, there was one anti-abortion law that somebody wanted to force through in some state in the 90s. It was based on the idea that that the father and mother both have to consent to an abortion, and that basically they found that the largest number of people who would refuse to consent to abortions were convicted rapists.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all.
And the law ended up being scrapped at that point because they realized what would end up happening. They'd be giving rapists the power to make. That was when, obviously, that there was still some sort of shame about this.
Right.
Because now they appear to be fully embracing the idea that the rapist should have the right to custody of his baby.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many states that were already allowing it. It's just that nobody really talked about it, which I have to say is also Roe v. Wade went down, and that was very, very bad. But I will say again, a lot of people were not taking reproductive rights seriously before that, and so if you didn't see that,
didn't have any abortion clinics when it was legal.
Yeah.
I mean, let's start there. There weren't any abortion clinics in Mississippi when it was legal.
Right. And so, yeah, there were states that had no clinics, states that had one clinic, states that had the ridiculous, you have to wait 48 hours. And
Kentucky saved their ban and stopped their ban, but Kentucky has only one abortion clinic in the whole state because of laws that Democrats cooperated with, making it really difficult to run one.
But I'm supposed to believe that, a lot of people who are scared.
In many cases, Democrats cooperated in passing these laws, making it hard to run an abortion clinic because they wanted to be seen as meeting Republicans halfway on abortion and respecting their beliefs.
Yep. And now here we are, but it's I think that also speaks to the sort of, earlier we were talking about the I got mine, fuck you, the hyper individualism of things. And a lot of people didn't really care about reproductive health because they figured they would be fine where they live if they needed an abortion. And then when Roe v. Wade went down, suddenly a lot of people started getting nervous. And it's you should have been nervous years ago.
It's a slippery slope from respecting Nazis' beliefs about abortion to respecting all their other beliefs.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I fully anticipate a lot more things coming. And I know I keep going back to sex worker rights and advocacy and issues, but like, with the way Sesta Fosta went down, that legislation was just absolutely horrific.
Yeah,
Um, and essentially made it,
made
criminalized.
people less safe.
Yeah, it absolutely did. It increased trafficking as well, like, which is
And
wild because everyone is, we're
and
anti-trafficking. Let's pass
the,
legislation that increases trafficking.
the people who are most empowered by the so-called anti-trafficking laws that are being passed to hurt sex workers are the actual people who are doing any sort of real coercive trafficking, because
Yes, absolutely.
they're the ones whose business isn't being hurt when Backpage goes away.
Exactly. And we tried to explain that, and nobody listened. And then after Backpage went down, police were like, "Oh, there's huge spikes in trafficking and outdoor workers." And it's like, well, this is what you advocated for, which was also very bizarre because Backpage had previously been commended for working with the federal government to try to identify trafficking victims on their website, which nobody
Yep.
knows. Like that part of the story never made it into into popular culture. But with stuff like Sesta Fosta passing and making it essentially illegal to talk about certain things online or to share information and pool resources, which is ultimately what happened. Um, people didn't care because it was sex workers, but now they're starting to use trafficking for going out of state to have an abortion and calling it abortion trafficking. Like, can you not connect the dots yet? Like, you don't see where this is going? Like, it's going to very soon, and oh God, what state was it?
You
I
see
think it was.
you see a similar thing with drugs, whereas these RICO laws that were used to go after drug dealers for everything but actually selling drugs are now being used to charge protesters who are
Yes,
protesting against cops.
yes. And it's like, I don't, you know, everyone always has this, people say that I'm too, I don't know, like people have an issue that it's like you're defending too many bad demographics of people. And it's like, it's not that I'm trying to defend quote unquote bad people, which bad people is a very vague term anyway, but it's not that I'm trying to defend bad people. It's that I know once you start passing legislation to go after the bad people, whoever the bad people is rapidly expands. And then one day it's you. And I'm just trying to have a certain sense of self preservation here.
Oh,
So,
well, one of the great personal misunderstandings in my life that led to losing friends was a statement about the way that I made a statement about how much of our drug war policy is based on this about pretending that drug users are infants who are incapable of operating with any autonomy or cost benefit analysis of their own, and
mhm,
incapable of making what they believe to be rational decisions for themselves,
yeah,
while at the same time saying that they should be responsible for their actions.
yes, yep,
And you want to have it both ways. You want to punish dealers because their customers are their victims, but then you want to punish the people you say are the victims of these evil dealers.
yep,
And a friend of mine who was a recovering addict and who saw their whole experience is defined by their abuse by evil dealers got very upset with me.
hmm. I mean, it is actually true though. And I find very much the same argument with sex workers is that sex workers are victims, all sex work is
Mm-hmm.
trafficking, all sex work is
Yeah.
rape, but also here's a bunch of laws to harm sex workers, right?
Yes.
And it's like how do you reconcile these things? Like I don't think people realize how many actual victims of sex trafficking get arrested. Like that
I know
happens
that the most famous injustice that I know of is that a black woman who was a victim of sex trafficking is still, to the best of my knowledge, serving a life sentence for killing her trafficker.
Yeah.
Whereas cops in countries where it is legal to be a sex worker but illegal to traffic are busy evicting sex workers and not going after traffickers.
But the Nordic model is going to help you because you can't be arrested. Yeah, okay. I hate the Nordic model.
So if every good man, if every, and I realize I'm falling into heteronormative labeling when I say this, but I'm saying because I'm doing it this way because I'm trying to point out the contradiction of the antis.
Mm-hmm.
If every good man in a woman's life is labeled a pimp because he sometimes receives money from her and she is a sex worker, then that means only the actual pimps will have any interest in being in her life.
Right. Right. No, that's incredibly accurate. And I don't think people really think, they're so caught up in the emotion of how they feel that they don't really, in the theory of what they think, but they don't really consider what the actual outcomes are. It's like once it gets put into practice, what would that actually look like? And I think people are not prepared for the consequences.
And it comes back to, and I use this metaphor specifically again because I really want someone to think about what we're talking about. And now we get back to the argument where from this sort of purist, absolutist vision of sin, it becomes acceptable to rape Christ because he hung out with sex workers.
I mean, yeah, that is kind of what they're arguing. I'll never admit it though, but that is kind of what they're arguing.
And when the reductio ad absurdum gets that intense, where you can say something like that and have it be technically true under the de facto standards in use,
Mm-hmm.
it's just like, what the fuck? Who do you actually want to protect?
Yeah, someone got very upset with me once because I pointed out that technically Jesus was a pimp.
So,
like, I mean, if your argument is that because there's a difference, of course, between like sex trafficking and a sex worker being around you or sharing money with you or pooling resources. Those are very different things. But if you're going to pretend that they're not, then
and that's the whole thing is that when you talk about a widow giving a lot of money to the early church, how is a widow making money?
Right.
Let's all stop and think about this right now. And you have to understand, considering the economic system of the time, how was a widow making money?
Investment banking or something.
Exactly.
But yeah, people don't want to think about it. And what actually scares me is how easy it is to throw sex workers under the bus. And of course, the way that this is tied to, the war on drugs, the racism, and the ableism that we already have. But I honestly see an argument almost going to essentially arguing that women's movement needs to be limited for their own protection. Like that's I see that as a logical outcome of where we're going, and everyone thinks I'm being paranoid about it. But
so let me give you an example of where this kind of protective thinking actually ends up, because there's a real example of it. In the 1920s, competitive figure skating was a men's sport. Only men competed. There were no technical rules against women competing. But in practice, except for doubles, which was specifically men and women skating together, which was there from the very beginning, except for doubles, women did not skate competitively. In the 1920s, a young woman named Madge Sayers, whose fiance and later husband was himself a professional skater and a coach, and who is it's the Annie Oakley story. He discovered her doing what he did better than he did it, and immediately stopped doing it himself to teach her to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so she became the first woman to compete against men in the World Figure Skating Championships. In a field of 17,
Mm-hmm.
all men but Madge,
Mm-hmm.
Madge won the silver medal.
Nice.
Now, here's the part where it gets complicated. The man who won it, his name was Ulrich Saukow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you watch figure skating or not, but if you ever watch Olympic figure skating and you hear someone talk about a triple Saukow,
yes,
Ulrich Saukow was the first person to do it. It's named after him. He was the first person to jump and spin in the air in figure skating. The fact that he could do it made him like Superman in a sport where everybody else was nailed to the ice. He could fly.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about literally the Babe Ruth of figure skating, right?
Right.
He gave Madge his gold medal and said she was the best skater on the ice.
Oh, wow.
And the judges were immediately accused of having been mean to a woman.
Oh.
And the judges, as a result of completely self-interested and self-preservation motivated reasons, banned women from competing.
Oh, geez. Okay.
And a couple of years later, out of pity, someone created women's figure skating.
That's ridiculous.
So this is what comes of it.
Yeah. And I think we're already starting to see some of the, like the...
Now, the direct corollary to this is, how would Madge Sayers feel about the feminists who say that she can't compete with another skater because that skater is quote unquote really a man?
Yeah. I can see it. And it's so frustrating to me that so many people who identify as leftists or feminists or, anything left of center are so willing to put their own rights in jeopardy because hating someone else is more important. I'll never get it. But it makes me think of Florida, right? They just did the strip club ban. You can't work in a strip club if you're under 21. And it's because it's for their own protection.
Yeah.
And it's like, but you're still an adult.
Yeah.
Like you can join the military, you can get deployed, you can go to a war zone, you can take out a student loan, you can go to college, you can buy a car, you can buy a house, but you can't be
about it. If you really think about it, what's the justification for voting at 18 but not drinking until 21? Are you just trying to ensure 3 years of sober voting? I mean, at least that would make sense. But I've never seen a "Don't Vote Drunk" campaign, so I don't believe it.
Exactly. And so, that is going to be like the next step, I think. But what's interesting to me is that everyone is only focused on the strippers. But really what the bill said was that anybody who's under 21 cannot work in that sort of stuff. And what I find fascinating about that is now you're actually denying people other jobs. Because, of course, like, obviously, stripper is going to be, like, the job everyone thinks of most, but a lot of strip clubs serve food. So that's also line cooks, bussers, waiters, or waitresses.
One of the places here is a strip vegan juice bar.
There you go.
I mean, Oregon, what can I say?
Right. But, yeah, people don't think about that. And it's like, so wait, why can't you be a dishwasher in a strip club because you're 19? Why can't you be a DJ? Why can't you be a valet? Why can't you be the hostess if it's the type of place that serves parties?
Because they've all seen Pretty Baby.
And it's fascinating to me how something that's supposed to protect young people is now actually denying them employment opportunities. And it's what was the reason? Like, you're actually hurting people by not letting them, be able to pursue, certain types of employment.
Well, so let's take a step back. Now, this is dystopian thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to remember that we live in a world which is basically an late 70s, early 80s cyberpunk dystopia without any of the cool parts.
Yeah.
So dystopian thinking is not necessarily alarmist or paranoid. Imagine a world, if you can, where nobody under 21 can get certain jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody can work at 14.
Right.
Now, you see, I can imagine a world where so-called able-bodied adults can't get work because they're all hiring teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And the only place that adults can get work are those places where only adults can work.
Right.
Which starts to look disturbingly like Victorian London.
Mm-hmm.
How did that work out the first time?
Right. And also worth noting, under that type of job restriction, and of course you'd have to focus on like the legalization aspect. This is why we always push for decrim when we talk about sex work. Is you have to also be able to get hired at a place where adults work.
Yes.
They won't take everybody. So what happens if you can't get hired because you don't have, even if you're able-bodied, you may not have the right body type, you might not have the right persona. Then what do you do?
Look at how laws. That's the way I would look at how laws about how people can or cannot participate in the legal drug trade serve to perpetuate the class inequities of the drug war.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I do have to run, though. I did not realize how late it is.
This is why I said don't be afraid to let me know if you have to go because frankly, the one time we tried to do a show before and ended up not doing it, I remembered how well the conversation went. And I thought this one might go a little long, and so you shouldn't be afraid to speak up if you were feeling tired or you needed to go.
Yeah, no, I do need to run, but this was fun, and we should definitely do it again, though.
It's totally my pleasure. I am trying to rebuild a regular rotation of recurring guests in addition to the occasional person who can bring in clicks.
Nice. I dig it.
And I've enjoyed the conversation. Is there anything you want to say or promote before we close out?
Donate to your local sex worker organization if you can. I highly recommend Swap USA. Otherwise, check me out on Twitter. Say hi. My DMs are always open, and I hope y'all enjoyed the show.
And I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Phoenix, for saying yes to me. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
It's been a great conversation. Hopefully, it's been a great show. You have yourself a great day. And to you and to everyone else, I'll tweet at you.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Bye.